Hello, everybody, and welcome to Mrs. G's Story Time. We are reading Star of Light by Patricia St. John with permission of Moody Publishing Company, and we are reading Chapter 13, The Holiday Begins. Very early one morning in March, the English nurse woke, got out of bed at once, and ran up to her flat roof to look at the weather. It was going to be a fine day, she decided happily, and this was just as it should be. But this was a day she had looked forward to for so long. Her cousin from England was arriving to stay in a hotel for 2 weeks. Her husband was coming with her, and they were bringing Jenny. It was the thought of Jenny that made the English nurse very happy. She woke Kinza, who was lying in a ball on a mattress on the floor, her ginger kitten close beside her. The first thing she always did on waking was to stretch out her hand and make sure the kitten was there. If it had gone for a walk, she made a terrible fuss. But this morning all was well. Hand in hand, the English nurse and Kinza climbed the stairs onto the flat roof and sat down at a low, round table, eating breakfast together under a blue spring sky. "The little girl is coming today," announced the nurse as she tidied up and tried not to trip over Kinza and the kitten, who were playing on the floor with a ball. "We're going to take a holiday. We will go to the market together and buy nice things to eat, and then we'll make a feast for the little girl." A feast, shouted Kinza, jumping about like a clumsy goat kid and falling over a wastepaper basket. "I'll carry the basket for you. Let's go now." "Yes, let's," said the nurse, and off they went into the sunshine hand in hand. The nurse had not had a weekday holiday for a long time. She usually stayed inside in the morning, but today she had told the people not to come. She was going to be free to get ready for Jenny. Now, while it was still early, she was going to climb up the hillside behind the town and pick flowers. It was too far for Kinza, so when they had finished their shopping, she left her on the step of the donut shop in charge of Haman. She often did this when she was busy, for she felt quite sure the two children were probably brother and sister and should spend some time together. Kinza was always perfectly safe and happy when Haman looked after her, although she sometimes ended up rather greasy and not very keen on her dinner. She was very fond of donuts and would eat all that was offered to her. Once by herself, the nurse almost ran up the steep cobble streets past the tumble-down shacks on the outskirt of town and out through the gate in the ruined wall that led onto the hillside. She suddenly forgot that she would soon be middle-aged and felt very young indeed. She began picking the flowers that were growing all around her. "How beautiful they are," she thought. "I shall bring Jenny up here and we'll pick them together." As she thought of Jenny, she began to wonder how they would all get on together. Their lives were so different. Once when they had been growing up together, she and Elizabeth had been like sisters. But Elizabeth had married a rich man and gone to live in a beautiful home. Jenny had been brought up surrounded by beauty and peace and had everything that love and money could give. Aunt Rosemary could have made her home there with them, too, but while she was training to be a nurse, she had felt that God wanted her to go to Africa to help people and to care for the poor, ragged children. Elizabeth and her husband thought it was a foolish thing to do, and Aunt Rosemary had found it difficult to write and tell them about her life. Their letters had been mainly about Jenny, and every Christmas Elizabeth had sent Rosemary a photograph of her as she grew up, and Rosemary had kept them all in a little photo album. The last picture had been of Jenny on her pony. Rosemary wondered how Jenny would feel about the simple toys the Moorish children enjoyed. She was used to expensive dolls and pauper beds and riding her pony about her father's estate. She would probably get very bored. Feeling rather sad, Rosemary hurried back down the mountain with her flowers, collected a happy, sticky Kinza, and went home. She went to the toy cupboard and inspected it rather sadly. There were some shabby scrapbooks, faded puzzles, and chipped bricks, and some scruffy little dolls and a box of stubby chalk. They had all obviously been enjoyed by the children who had never seen toys before, and all the toys were well worn. Rosemary shut the cupboard with a sigh and went to the kitchen to make buns. By 4:30, the little house was as bright as scrubbing and polishing could make it, and the sitting room was sweet with the scent of wildflowers. Tea was ready and the kettle was singing on the stove, and Rosemary and Kinza set out to meet the car in front of the hotel. It arrived punctually, a smart, streamlined vehicle, and little boys surged around, fighting each other in their efforts to carry the luggage. Rosemary stood waiting for her relatives to get out, and above the pandemonium, she heard a child's voice cry out, "Oh, Mummy, look! What a sweet little girl! You never told me Aunt Rosemary had a little girl." The moment they took themselves out from the mob of little boys, Elizabeth, looking just as young as she had looked 10 years before, was kissing her cousin warmly. Jenny was squatting on the ground, trying to make friends with Kinza. "Jenny," said her mother sharply, "you haven't greeted Aunt Rosemary." Jenny got up and kissed her aunt politely and turned back to Kinza. While the adults sorted out the luggage, passports, and forms, Rosemary stood quietly, watching the child whom for years she had longed to see. An elfland-looking child, she thought, and went over to make friends. Jenny turned a troubled face to her aunt. "What is the matter with this little girl?" she asked. "I showed her my pretty brooch, and she just stared in front of her." "I'm afraid she's blind," Jenny said Rosemary gently, "but it doesn't mean you can't play with her. You must give her toys she can feel, and then you can sing to her and let her touch you. She'll soon love you." Rosemary lifted Kinza's tiny hands and passed it lightly over Jenny's face and hair. "That's how she gets to know people," she explained, and then she turned to speak to Jenny's mother and father. But before she could say anything, Jenny had seized her mother's hand and was looking up at her, her gray eyes beaming with tears. "She's blind, Mummy," she whispered, "like the little Christmas children." "Never mind," replied Mrs. Swift gently. "She looks like a very happy little girl, and we must find her a little present. Now let's come and see Aunt Rosemary's house." They set off across the market, grown-ups walking ahead, and Jenny leading Kinza, too interested in her new playmate to notice much of the town about her. She was happier than she'd ever been all holiday for. Much as she loved her mother and father, she was only 9, and she longed for other children to play with. Most of all, she longed for something to look after. She was too old for dolls, and her pets had all been left at home, and she missed them dreadfully. But a curly-haired, blind baby of 3 was far better than pets. She had never dreamed of anything so exciting. They had reached the narrow back streets where Rosemary lived, and Mrs. Swift was talking in a rather strained voice, trying not to look too hard at the babies sitting on the cobbles and the ragged old beggars chanting in one of the doorways. Then she suddenly looked very horrified indeed, for Rosemary had stopped in front of the last house and was taking out her key. On the doorstep sat a very poor old woman, holding something to her breast under her rags. Rosemary spoke to the woman, who pulled aside her rags and held out a baby, all skin and bones, half dead with sickness and exhaustion. Mrs. Swift put out her hand to take hold of Jenny, but she was too late. Her child had stepped forward, and both she and Rosemary were stooping over the pathetic little creature, quite absorbed. "Jenny," commanded her mother, "come here." And then Jenny did not take the slightest notice. She turned tragic eyes to her aunt. "Is it going to die?" she whispered. "I don't know. I hope not," replied Rosemary. "Let's go in." She opened the front door and led the woman into the room where she gave out the medicines, and she told her to sit down while she turned back to her guest. Mrs. Swift was standing very still, recovering from her shock at finding such a wretched creature on Rosemary's doorstep. She noticed that the young mother had a patient face, one used to suffering, and with beautiful dark eyes that gleamed with hope as she lifted her baby towards the nurse. "Rosemary," she urged, "don't worry about us. We can look after ourselves. You go and see to that poor baby." Rosemary hesitated. "Well, come upstairs," she said, "and I can show you where the sitting room is. Tea is all ready and the kettle is boiling." It was a surprise to enter a house on a dingy street and find it bright with pictures and flowers and a delicious meal set on the pretty china. Rosemary sat down on the low mattress seats and made tea, and then she spoke rather shyly. "It seems awfully rude," she said, "but would you mind if I left you here just for 10 minutes? You see, I know this woman. She's lost 4 babies, and this one is all she's got." Jenny slipped her hand into her aunt's. "I'm going to help you," she announced. "No, Jenny," exclaimed her mother firmly. "It's out of the question. Come and sit down and drink your tea." Jenny flew into a passion at once. "I want to go," she stormed. "I want to see the baby get well. I don't want any tea. Say I can come, Aunt Rosemary. It's your house." "Daddy, say I can come. Mummy, you must let me." Her father most unexpectedly came to Jenny's rescue. "What's the matter with the baby?" he asked. "Has it got anything infectious?" "I shouldn't think so," replied Rosemary. "I've seen it before. She's suffering from starvation and improper feeding." Then, Elizabeth, I would let her go, if Rosemary doesn't mind, said Mr. Swift. As Jenny left the room triumphantly with Rosemary, he turned to his wife. Darling, he said, let her help all she can. She needs to help someone. It may make her a little less selfish to see that sort of thing, and I'm sure Rosemary will be sensitive about infection. Perhaps so, agreed Jenny's mother, and she gave a little sigh. If only she would have had little brothers and sisters, she added wistfully. Meanwhile, Jenny and her aunt were bending over the white-faced baby, and the mother telling the usual tale of poverty, ignorance, and improper feeding. It seemed almost too late to help, but perhaps there was still a chance. Rosemary, nursing the little thing in the blanket, turned to Jenny. Go upstairs, Jenny, she said, and bring me a cup and a spoon and some sugar from the shelf above the stove. Jenny obeyed, moving swiftly and lightly. Now go and fetch the kettle, commanded her aunt. Jenny was off in a flash. Now bring me those white tablets on the third shelf over there, her aunt went on, speaking very gravely, and Jenny had an uncomfortable feeling that her aunt disapproved of her. Now please rinse out the cup and spoon some of that boiled water. Crush up the tablet and mix it with a little water, and pass me that bottle. Jenny forgot her temper, forgot her aunt, and forgot herself. She knelt perfectly still on the mat, only conscious of the weak gurgling sound as the baby tried to swallow. Almost drop by drop, the medicine disappeared, and the baby was not sick. After a few more spoonfuls of sweetened water, Rosemary began talking to the mother in Arabic, explaining that she must sit quietly for an hour, and then they would give the child another drink. It must get better, muttered Jenny to herself. It must. And then Rosemary did something that surprised Jenny. She pointed to the picture on the wall of Jesus holding a child in his arms and told the woman all about it. Then she prayed aloud for the sick little baby, and Jenny could not understand what her aunt was saying, but she knew she was praying. I wonder if it really does any good, thought Jenny, and she too glanced at the painting on the wall. Somehow the sight of the child in the picture being held so closely made the real baby seem safer. It's sure to get better, breathed Jenny to herself, bending over it again. And as she watched, the weak eyelids fluttered, and the baby opened her eyes. Tomorrow we'll read chapter 14, A Light Begins to Shine. I love you, and I'm praying for you, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.